Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana, Serafin, also Senior Fellow at Carnegie Council. Welcoming in a few minutes, Ryan Goodman, NYU Professor of Law, who is also the co-editor-in-chief of Just Security, which has been publishing some great articles on the Russia-Ukraine war. And we'll be talking to him about war crimes today ahead of a very busy week on that topic. But Nick, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Elon Musk and Twitter, because I think that the digital space is really important for the Doorstep. And we just came out of World Press Freedom Day, which is really important considering everything that's going on the ground. I'm wondering if you have any concerns about our social media and our free speech with this move. I have some thoughts on Elon Musk, but I want to hear what you were thinking about him. And it's a really big story, and I want to make sure that we talk about it because it does also impact what we're going to talk about in a few minutes with Ryan as well in terms of collecting information on open source platforms.
Well, I think that Musk's efforts to acquire Twitter are, the latest line in a trend which some find disturbing and others simply see as market realities of wealthy, super empowered individuals who are able, with deep pockets, to take control of important pieces of communication in the public square. Newspapers, broadcast outlets, social media outlets on which people depend. And I think that this is really, we keep going back and forth between whether or not something like Twitter is a private space to which we all who take part in it agree to abide by the rules of the owners, and he who has the money makes the rules, or are they utilities? Are they something that is a way in which people communicate and interact? And I think one of the problems that we've had is we keep bouncing back and forth. When people find it useful to say Twitter is a private company and it can do whatever it wants as a private company because say you want someone to be deplatformed from Twitter, that's one thing. On the other hand, then when you flip 180 degrees to say, well, now it's a public utility and it can't be entrusted to private shareholders in the market, we've been very inconsistent in this. And I think that this is part of this larger debate about access to information and the ability to participate and have your voice heard. To what extent are those rights? To what extent are those privileges? And who's going to pay for it? Private capital, the state, taxpayer money. It's not just simply with regard to Twitter, but with major newspapers, major broadcast outlets. These questions keep coming up. And then the question of, is this a public service or is this something to be monetized? Because certainly some of the things that have been discussed for Twitter would have a real impact on educational and institutions or places like ours with an educational mission where retweeting, commenting is really part of what we do. And if that's going to be monetized, then that has a real impact on the ability to reach out to an audience, not only with our own material at the Doorstep, but when we comment on stories or things that Doorstep guests have been doing. If all of that is going to be now subject to a pay-for-play approach, then that has real ramifications for the open dialogue and discussion that we're trying to foster.
Yeah, and certainly it has ramifications for the open source collection of information that we'll be discussing with Ryan right now. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ryan, on such an important topic, documenting war crimes in Ukraine, especially after the EU Commission president yesterday said that the EU would sanction military officers involved in suspected war crimes in Bucha and Mariupol. She said, you will be held accountable. And so I think that this sentence encapsulates what we're trying to understand today with you. In particular for our audience, to start at the very beginning with the definition of war crimes versus genocide, because I think that people are conflating the two when they're looking at the issue. And I think we need to start off with understanding what is the difference and what are people looking into. So first off, thank you again for joining us. And if you can lead us through this for our audience today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. So yeah, the baseline understanding of what are war crimes versus what is genocide. War crimes are essentially violations of the Geneva Conventions, which would be very familiar to a lot of people. They are the kinds of atrocities that we might think of being committed by armed forces in the heat of battle or against POWs and the targeting of civilians and things like that. So violations of international humanitarian law during armed conflict. And that might be with respect to targeting or might be with respect to treatment of detainees and the like. Genocide is also an international crime. It does not have to take place in an armed conflict. And it is a very specific crime in the sense that it's not just a persecution of a civilian population, but it is an attempt to destroy or eliminate the civilian population of a particular type in whole or in part. And when I say of a particular type, it means to destroy, for example, a religious group or a national group of a particular type in whole or in part, wiping them out, extermination in a certain sense. And that's why it's thought of as, one of the gravest international crimes imaginable.
Now, President Biden has actually called what Russia is doing in Ukraine a genocide. I think that there are investigations going on, though, primarily on the war crimes front. And I want to kind of talk about today about this collection and how the digital age has changed the collection of information, because I think this is really, once we understand what we're looking for, according to your definition, we have to understand that the digital age has really changed the way we're collecting information. And how do you see that changing? And I want to really call out Just Security for doing some great work on this topic, some great articles looking at what civilians are doing, what human rights groups are doing. But can you talk today with us about how the digital era has changed this idea of collecting data, and maybe not just in Ukraine, but in other conflicts too?
Yeah, so it really has revolutionized, in a certain sense, evidence that can be put to war crimes trials. Civilians, just individuals on the ground, videoing what they see before them as witnesses, uploading it in such a way that it can be easily verified and traceable. And they can provide prosecutors with incredible information. Now, at one level, they can provide prosecutors with information that they can use in their investigations as leads at a minimum. And then the second is they can provide evidence that is so reliable it can actually be used in trial to prosecute individuals. And some of this information can also demonstrate patterns of behavior, so that if you see a particular incident occurring in one area of, let's say, Ukraine or any particular country, a very important question is if that's actually a pattern. And a pattern might be something that we can then begin to infer is actually a part of the policy of the state or of the armed forces, not just some rogue actors. So it's also that the ways in which the evidence can start to transform that. And now we have, non-governmental organizations like Bellingcat is at the leading edge of this, that are able to also identify the military vehicles that are being used, the battalion commanders that are, at the point of the spear and therefore are potentially criminally liable for the acts of their subordinates. So it's not just the witnessing of the war crimes themselves, but actually able to identify who's responsible for them.
I think that's so interesting what you said, because here I was reading about Andriy Smirnov from Ukraine's Office of the President talking about his book of torturers, Identifying specifically, as you say, the battalion commanders at the point of the spear. How has, things like, Elon Musk's, satellite links and, phones with civilians change the way that this information can be not only gathered, but verified? Can you talk with that a little bit in terms of how it's accessible to a court in a different ways than maybe in the past?
So in a certain level, it's not my technical expertise, but my understanding is that they're able to do things like geolocate, timestamps, and other verifications of the ways in which the information is uploaded, where it's uploaded from. So there are ways in which they can determine if it's authentic or inauthentic. This has enabled, as I mentioned, it's very easy in a certain sense, or much easier to enable investigations. It's gonna be harder to enable evidence that can be used at trial. But the International Criminal Court has, in fact, used that very kind of evidence in the past. So it's a huge enterprise that they have to go through, sorting that information and getting the signal from the noise. And so many people are uploading the information at a certain level, it actually becomes difficult given just the quantity that's being uploaded, and the need to find, what can be authenticated as well.
Mm. I remember early on in the war, Bellingcat saying that they were shifting their efforts to just focusing on authenticating data because of the volume of information. But what strikes me is that we haven't heard much talk of misinformation coming out, fake videos, perhaps because there's so many people authenticating and, with technical skills way more advanced than even 10 years ago or 5 years ago, that you're not hearing much of fake information coming out in terms of, creating war crimes that don't exist. Are you hearing any of that on the ground or covering that in just security world?
Yeah, we are alert to the issue, but similarly have not seen it, but are always aware that it could be coming down the pike. In fact, that's in a certain sense one of the methods of operation of Russian military intelligence, which is to feed in misinformation and, in fact, to give the kind of misinformation that people are anticipating, so that they expect it to be true because it does fit in with what they're seeing otherwise, but then they can pull the rug out from under it by saying that's inauthentic, or that now being if the prosecutors at any moment ever rely on what has become what is actually misinformation, even planted by the Russians, that would be a serious problem. So they have to have a very high threshold and small, very tiny margin of error, because they could, the prosecutor could present 100 pieces of this kind of what we call open source intelligence, OSINT. And if one of them is misinformation, even if planted by the Russians and revealed to be planted by the Russians, that would be a serious problem. So I think everybody's quite alert to that. And the authentication is not just of the particular individual piece of data, but that it can be compared with other data that's coming in as well.
And that touches on something that we've seen and from the Russian side, and we've seen other countries do this, that when you have incidents and it becomes, well, we just don't know what really happened, fog of war. We saw that with the claims about Bucha. Well, who knows when these people were killed and why and who did it? We saw this in Syria and so on and so forth. But has the level of collection and authentication reached a point where we can push back against claims of the fog of war to say, no, we're very sure about when something happened, who did it, who the perpetrators are, to push back against that? Because that is, Tatiana mentioned misinformation, but also this toolkit of just simply saying the truth is unknowable. And therefore, you make claims, we make claims, everyone makes claims, and either the claims are unknowable or unverifiable. Do we have a high level of confidence now, increasingly, because of open source collection, because of new ways of verifying data, because as you said, we're looking at patterns and we're putting it all together, where we can have a high degree of confidence to say we know what has happened, we know that crimes have occurred, and we know who the perpetrators are.
Yes, so there is a really good story to be told here that in fact, we do have such a high volume of authenticated, valid information that the information space, it's able to actually very quickly verify and rebut misinformation. And one of the best examples is the Busha massacres, where the Russians were saying, oh no, this wasn't us, this was the Ukrainian forces that came in afterwards. And then there's satellite imagery showing from weeks before Russian vehicles occupying the town and the cadavers of civilians lining the streets. So it's been very good in terms of how quickly that has been activated. And what's also happening to a certain extent, which I think our society globally and nationally has lost, are intermediaries or institutions of trust. Ukrainian authorities have done a very good job of having a high level of trustworthiness when they rebut with evidence. And Bellingcat is another example, high level of trustworthiness. And the US intelligence community has also done a very good job and has reoriented itself fairly dramatically in this crisis to declassify material in order to rebut these kinds of claims. And I always think about, in a certain sense, it's a more general thought that the idea of alternative facts do not work in a court of law. A court of law will sort out what are alternative facts and what aren't. So this is just in the information space of the domain of global public attention. But when we actually also get to the trials, I think it will be very strong cases being brought by the prosecutors.
Excellent segue into the question I wanted to ask in terms of prosecution, to talk about the different levels, right? So there's that which can happen within Ukraine, currently happening. There's regional bodies, there's the International Court of Justice. Where are we? What is the difference? What can Ukraine actually do in this particular instance? As an example, with these war crimes and the evidence that's being gathered, and against who is it going to be? Targeted? Putin, the generals.
Right. So I think the 2 to 3 places that I would look for where we can anticipate trials are the Ukraine national authorities, other national authorities who are currently investigating, including Lithuania, Poland, Germany. Germany's probably got the most sophisticated system in terms of already having tried war crimes out of Syria. And so that's the Ukrainian authorities, then other national authorities in the region, and then of course the International Criminal Court. I do think that it is quite realistic that there will be prosecutions. There will be some forms of accountability, in part because Ukraine has in their custody many Russian soldiers, including presumably military officers. President Zelensky mentioned, they have a pilot who has his instructions on a sheet of targeting civilian objects. And, Ukraine has at this point killed 12 Russian generals. I think, with time, one of those generals will not be killed, but will be captured. So I think it's very realistic that we'll actually see trials. And I also think, I think the big question is, will the most senior people who are responsible for this, Putin and his high command, ever see a courtroom? I think there are 2 answers to that. One is very unlikely. It's just realistically, it's just very unlikely, unless he is thrown out of office. And then the second is, what I do think still is very likely, is he'll be indicted. I think it's very likely that the International Criminal Court, with the evidence it's getting, will indict a sitting head of state of a major world power, Vladimir Putin, And that on its own is quite a bombshell. And it, for better or worse, it's a very complicated situation. It will impede his ability, it currently impedes his ability to travel internationally, which is another message to the Russian people. Like, you are led by an individual who cannot represent your state internationally. But I do think that day is coming, with one footnote, which is maybe a diplomatic deal is worked out in which the Security Council under the International Criminal Court Treaty is able to suspend the investigation, let's say with respect to Putin. And that's part of the peace negotiations or something like that.
Interesting. Just to clarify, because I do understand that Ukraine and Russia are not part of the ICC. Is that correct? And does that affect anything that we've discussed?
So, so far has not affected anything we've discussed, except for, anything we've discussed so far, in the sense that a few years ago, Ukraine, even though it's not a party to the International Criminal Court Treaty, did enter a declaration with the International Criminal Court, which you can do on an ad hoc basis, and basically said from a year like 2015 forward, you have jurisdiction over anything that occurs in Ukraine. So the International Criminal Court has complete jurisdiction over any war crimes that are committed in Ukraine's territory by any actors. If they ever went down the path of thinking about crimes against humanity or genocide, they have jurisdiction over that. They do not, the International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. So the launching of the war itself, even though that is a crime within the court's treaty, both states must be parties, and they're not.
Okay. I wanted to, you tweeted this recently, and I wanted to touch upon it because there is this issue. Well, how are these, war crimes committed? You discussed what they are. But you tweeted this article from Just Security, the missing coverage in the Russian war about cluster munitions. And could you talk to us about why that's important and what's been missing in the coverage? Why we need to be paying attention to it. So part of what we do here at the Doorstep for our audience is bring them to issues they really should be looking at. And so I've heard the term cluster munitions. I don't really know what they are. I'm not a military person, but why do they matter and why should we be paying attention?
Great. So this matters, and I can mention another topic that comes under the heading of what is the Biden administration's policy toward war crimes being committed in Ukraine? What is the US policy toward it? That's what's been missing. And what reporters have not recognized and commentators have not recognized is that the Biden administration has been cagey when it comes to one of the most serious war crimes being committed, which is the use of cluster munitions. And so what's happening is Russia is using these particular kinds of munitions, which include, when they explode, hundreds, can be thousands, but hundreds of little bomblets that spread out at random. And if used in a densely populated civilian area, it's going to kill civilians. And they also end up having a very high dud rate. So they stay there as essentially landmines. And they are also apparently very attractive to children. So children pick them up and either get killed, lose limbs, things like that. So there is a movement internationally to ban cluster munitions across the board. The United States, Russia, and Ukraine have not signed that treaty. They will maintain the position that cluster munitions can be used. And therefore, what has been missing is somebody saying to the United States, can you please condemn Russia for its use of cluster munitions? Because you, United States, we obviously assume would never use cluster munitions in a densely populated civilian area. You have said you want to use cluster munitions, for example, against a column of tanks on a battlefield. And they haven't done it so far. So the piece was written by a former NSC official who knows this area extremely well, saying, look, the United States can still maintain its current policy and stand out and to the world community and say, but you can't use cluster munitions in a civilian populated area like that. That's part of the problem, that they haven't done that. And there's also cause for the United States to reflect more deeply upon what the U.S. policy should be with respect to U.S. cluster munitions. But that's, one concern. And then the other one I'll just flag is the other concern about U.S. policy towards war crimes being committed in Ukraine is that the U.S. government, under multiple administrations, Democratic and Republican, have taken the position that the International Criminal Court should not exercise jurisdiction in a country against nationals of a state that are not party to the treaty. Yeah. So in a country like Afghanistan, in which the United States government has said you should not exercise jurisdiction over US nationals for, let's say, engaging in the CIA torture program. And the big question is will the Biden administration change its policy by supporting the International Criminal Court, which would be exercising jurisdiction over the exact equivalent nationals, Russian nationals in Ukraine. And there's good news to report on that front, which it does seem as though they are turned the corner. The US War Crimes Ambassador, Beth Van Schaack, said we welcome the prosecutor's investigation. Jen Psaki said we welcome the prosecutor's investigation. And then for folks like me who closely watch every single word that comes out of their mouths, then the War Crimes Ambassador, Beth Van Schaack, at the UN Security Council meeting a few days ago said, we welcome and support. So, which is very significant. Support means support. It means helping in all likelihood with things like sharing of intelligence information. Going back to the earlier part of our conversation, the best intelligence information is obviously possessed by the United States intelligence community. Providing that to the prosecutor would be immensely helpful, as the United States has done in other cases with the International Criminal Court, but not one with this particular makeup in terms of jurisdiction.
How much do you think that this change in policy or movement in the change in policy is driven by regular citizens, is driven by, what we call here at the doorstep concerns. And I ask specifically because I was randomly at a farmer's market this weekend and, wearing my Ukraine pin, and, a veteran Vietnam vet came up to me and said, you're going to win in Mariupol because we're going to give you the weapons. And it was such an interesting doorstep support of an issue far away, right? If you look at the big scope of countries and problems the United States has, right? And it was kind of shocking for me in this small town in the middle of nowhere that this conversation happened. And I'm wondering what you see as a change in policy at the top driven, or do you think it's driven by things on the bottom, or do you think it's driven by, other countries pushing the United States? Where do you see that push-pull happening?
I definitely think that there is a direct relationship to the upsurge of support among the American populace for trying to do something to address what they see in their television screens and on social media and the like, in terms of just atrocities being committed. And if anything, they're maybe pushing, some parts of the American populace are pushing towards even greater level of US commitment in terms of whether there'd be any kind of military commitment like a no-fly zone. But in terms of the accountability piece, I think here's a great measure of that reflection of American public sentiment. The US Senate, which has generally been a little bit skittish about the International Criminal Court, unanimously passed a resolution supporting the International Criminal Court's investigation of Russian war crimes in Ukraine, led by Senator Lindsey Graham. And he gave a speech beforehand, a press briefing specifically on this topic, and could not have been a stronger supporter for the court. And I think that's remarkable. And there are at least 36 Republicans on the House side who have also now sponsored legislation. They might all, even greater numbers vote for it, but sponsored legislation explicitly supportive of the International Criminal Court. So I think it reflects this kind of bipartisan, cross-ideological grounds or non-ideological, in the sense of some kind of forceful response to towards the arc of justice, bending in a certain sense to deal with the atrocities that we're seeing that are just on a scale that is of the worst sort, that even in our discussion, we have to include, whether or not it's genocide. So I think that that's really something very significant is happening, and it makes it easier for the Biden administration to change policy because of the domestic political space it has to maneuver here.
Can I just ask on that, with the members of Congress, do you see any sense that because we're out of Iraq and Afghanistan now, that some of the concerns that legislators might have had about applying these principles have diminished, or do you think that that's unrelated, that they would have support, even if the U.S. was still engaged militarily in Afghanistan, that they would be supporting in the numbers that you said, unanimously in the Senate, 36 Republicans in the House sponsoring these measures, if the U.S. was still actively engaged in these types of operations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I kind of, one hat that I wear is like a social science hat. I think it has to have a relationship to it. There's just a lack of exposure at present, and in some ways in future, because the Biden administration policy, I think, would probably be followed by the next administration, regardless of who it is, in terms of the over horizon strikes. It's just not a presence of U.S. troops on the ground, given our technological capabilities, for better or for worse, in terms of how we use the technological capabilities, but it's just not the same exposure. And then recently, the new chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Court on the Afghanistan chapter basically said, I'm going to prioritize the Taliban. So it's like turning a page, and then so that exposure has been reduced or eliminated. And then I think I agree with your, I think that's right in the sense of presently and in the future, at least the foreseeable future, a lack of that exposure. Yeah.
Where do you see the U.S. in the global stage with this effort? Are we leading in terms of, Germany, Poland, or are we following sentiment?
So I think that we are leading when it comes to war crimes accountability, along with others who are out in front. So Germany is one good example, and then some of the states that are neighboring Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, and others, when it comes to war crimes. I also think that we are in some ways out there in front on this question of genocide, given President Biden's statement. Now, at the end of his statement, he also said, but I'll let the lawyers decide. Like, he's basically saying, this is my sentiment, but the lawyers, and there's an entire bureaucratic process to make a determination as to whether or not the facts meet that genocidal definition. And the lawyers will be, in the room for sure. They'll be leading those conversations. And the Canadian House of Commons unanimously voted that it is a genocide. There are 2 East European states that have called it a genocide. So but that's still a bit of a sprinkling in a sense, so that with President Biden, we're kind of out there in front. Where the United States is not exactly out in front is the crime of aggression. And there are, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, the International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. So that's the Russian resort to war in manifest violation of the UN Charter. And there's a diplomatic conversation happening right now. There'll be a big meeting on Friday in Lithuania, an international conference, to create a special tribunal for the crime of aggression, as was created after World War II at Nuremberg. And there are different machinations of what it might be. It could be the UN General Assembly enters into a treaty with Ukraine. I actually think that one is on the firmest footing if they could get it done diplomatically. And then plan B is kind of an ad hoc coalition of states. Apparently there are 6 now, including Ukraine, that will create a special tribunal to try aggression. And the United States is not anywhere there, as far as I can tell. But that also might be a good thing in the sense that if the US leads it, then it maybe looks like a US versus Russia. It raises other questions of, to be candid, hypocrisy when it comes to what has the US itself done in the past. And I also think that that one might be one in which the United States might have concerns about how other states in the world in the future could create a special tribunal. And you have to think about, like, what stops Russia and Belarus from creating a special tribunal? Yeah. So that's one where I think there might be a very reasoned basis for why the United States is not leading.
Well, I think we'll look ahead to what's happening on Friday and hope to have you back to understand and analyze in a future Doorstep podcast. Thank you so much for your time today.
I really appreciate it. Thanks for the conversation.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.